Hi there and welcome to another video. In this video I'll be following on from my previous introduction to Bifrost USD and how stages work to explore how we can use Bifrost USD to build this stage, add some layers, and then how we can add some data into this stage to eventually save this all out to USD. So for this video I'm going to continue to use my Bifrost USD workspace. And the concept that I'm going to follow is this sublayer example that's included in the Pixar USD glossary. So the Pixar USD glossary is a free online resource and is just one part of the total documentation that Pixar have provided to support USD. It's completely free, so I'll include a link in the description below for you to take a look at it. Now in this example, I want to use layers. And I also want to save those layers out as USD files themselves. So I'm just going to follow this basic concept here of like a shot and a sequence. And this is just one possible combination that you can include and create as part of your USD stage. Now this example is also included in the free Bifrost USD Lab Pack that Autodesk have provided to the community. And if you can download that lab pack and install it, it's going to be included here in the Bifrost browser. So when I've installed it, there's a separate USD section here, and there's a subsection called glossary. And here are various examples that refer back to that Pixar USD glossary, but they've all been created using Bifrost USD. And here you'll notice there's one called sublayers. And if we click on the info icon here, it will tell us where the actual JSON file is. Also in the description, you'll note that it says that this implements the sublayers example from the Pixar USD glossary webpage. Now I could just import this to save time, but for the purposes of this video, I'm not going to do that. And instead I want to build this up totally from scratch. Now, before I really get into this, I recommend that you check out my other USD videos on my channel so that you have a basic understanding of USD and also how it works inside Maya, and it will make it easier for you to follow along to this video. Now, we start by creating a graph, and you can also rename this graph if you want to. I like to do so as good practice because if you start creating additional graphs in your scene, or maybe import something from the Bifrost browser, you can lose track of things. So with our graph created, we can now start adding the nodes that we require to build out the stage. However, I'm not entirely sure what those nodes actually are at this moment in time. I know that I'm not going to need this input node because this is required for bringing in data from the Maya scene into Bifrost, and we don't have any data yet in our scene. So this is pretty much redundant, so I'm just going to delete it. Now, in my previous video where I explained how stages work in Bifrost USD, I spoke about using the node add to stage as the starting point. And this was because it was mentioned in the Autodesk documentation and in some other videos. And it does make sense because you're nearly always going to need this particular node in order to add things like USD prims or USD attributes to your stage. However, for this video and my other ones, I'm going to kind of ignore this because in some ways it feels backwards to me to actually use an add node first before we've actually created anything in Bifrost and also USD. So instead, I'm going to follow in the same principles that I have done in my other Bifrost videos. We'll create something first, get data flowing through the Bifrost graph, and then look at how we add things. So I need to start creating the USD stage, but I'm not entirely sure what nodes I'm going to require. The best starting point is probably just to tab into the Bifrost menu and start looking at the USD category here. And there's lots of subcategories listed, but the main one we want is stage. And if we look under this subcategory, we can just go through the names and see if they maybe just by their name look like they do what we actually are trying to do. Now we've got open stage, open layer, open USD stage, but there's one here at the top that says create USD stage. So I'm actually going to start with this one first. And when we bring it into our graph and look at the info panel, it pretty much does what it says on the tin really. It says it creates a new USD stage. And remember, the best way to think about Bifrost nodes themselves are they're a series of instructions that we're telling Bifrost to actually do something, a bit like a line of code or in a line of a script, except we're using nodes to formulate those instructions. So this instruction is create a new USD stage, and we now need Bifrost to execute and run that instruction. And we do this by taking the output here, which is the new stage, and then we plug it into the Bifrost output here, which is essentially the end of our graph, where everything we do within our graph always goes into the output, and Bifrost then executes all the instructions that are being fed into it here. Now, when I connect this up, you'll notice straight away we get a stage here on the output. We have a new MayaUSD proxy node in our outliner, and we also have some layers being populated in our USD layer editor. So we basically have a new USD stage. Now, before going any further, there's something that I need to consider before I build things up too much, and that's how I intend to save out USD data. I'm intending to work entirely in Bifrost USD for everything. That means anything I want to do with this stage will be done in the Bifrost graph itself, and not with any of the features in Maya's menus or any direct manipulation in the Maya viewport. I'm also intending to add sublayers to my stage that I want to be saved out to disk as separate USD files. Now, at the moment, I can't do this because of this unshareable layer, and the root layer for our stage, which has been created, is just called .usd at the moment because we actually haven't defined a name for our stage, and therefore there's no name for the root layer. That's actually grayed out, and there's no ability here to save it to disk either. So at the moment, nothing is going to be saved to disk, not the stage or even any of the layers inside the layer editor. Now, to change this, we select the MayaUSD proxy, we go to our attribute editor, and under the stage section here, there's an option called shareable, and we need to tick this box. Now, when I do so, the unshareable layer is removed from the layer editor, and our default root layer has now become active, and we also now get our save disk icon back in the editor. So now we can actually start saving data out to disk. If I deactivate shareable, the unshareable layer comes back. Now, this concept of shareable and unshareable is another topic that I mentioned in my previous video about stages, and it can be very confusing, so I suggest you check out that video where I try and explain things with more clarity. But for now, and without repeating a long explanation, with this option disabled like it is now, this unshareable layer acts as a kind of sandbox for my Bifrost graph. I can still use the Bifrost graph, and I can still make changes and add things to the graph, but nothing is saved to disk. Instead, they're stored in this unshareable layer in Maya's memory, and then they're also saved with the Maya scene when that's also saved out to disk. But we're not actually saving any USD data itself. So when it comes to needing to add USD prims to your stage and saving that data to disk, then you'll need to make sure that this box is checked so that the stage is shareable. Now, for now, I'm going to keep this setting to shareable, but I might revisit this topic later on in the video. So returning to our stage, what are the next steps? Well, I guess the first starting point is to give our stage a name, and that will also rename our root layer that we have here. And also we can define a location of where we intend to save our USD data. Now, if we look at the info panel for this stage, where it describes the inputs and the outputs, the first input is called layer, and it actually says that this defines the file path under which the stage will be saved. And all the main three default USD formats are supported. We have the default generic .usd binary, the USD-A, which is the ASCII text version, and then USD-C, which is the crate or container binary. So if I just switch to the parameters, there's our layer section. And if we click on this little folder here, this will open up a simple save dialog, and we can point it to a location, and we can also define a name for our USD stage. I already know the location of where I'm intending to save my data out. So I'm just going to paste it into file name. That'll take me to that directory itself. And now I can give my stage a name. So I'll just call it Z Stage 01. Now it's important as well at this point that you always define and type in the actual file extension itself, because there's 3 different file formats here for .usd, but Bifrost won't know which particular format that you're intending to use. So you have to make sure you always define it. So I'm just going to go with a binary .usd and click save. And we can see here in our node that that path has now been added to our stage, and also the root layer for our stage has also now been renamed. Now this looks okay. We've got a very, very crude graph now going. We've got a simple node that says create a stage. This is the name of our stage, and this is the location of where we want this stage to be saved out to. But we're not actually doing any saving itself. We could do this here, but we really want to do it from within the actual graph itself, because everything in the graph needs to be consistent as well. And as I mentioned earlier, we're doing everything inside the Bifrost graph. So we need to introduce a new node now that will basically instruct Bifrost to save this stage out to disk, and also it will continue to do any more saving the more we add to our stage. Now, as to what node we actually require, then again, let's go to our Bifrost menu, look through the USD category and the stage subcategory, and again, look down the list to see if there's anything here that might look like it will work for us. And there's actually a node that says save USD stage. So that seems very self-explanatory to me. So let's click it and bring it into our graph, and we look at the info panel, and this basically again it gives us information of what this node actually does, and it says that it saves all modified layers in a Bifrost USD stage to disk, and all the main 3 USD formats are all fully supported. So we've got some inputs here and some output. The input is stage, and again this connects the stage that you want to save. So this is our stage, so we need to connect it to this input here. So we take that and plug it in there, and then the output is connect this output to an output node upstream, which is this here. This is the node upstream. So this is the instruction. So we're taking the stage, we're telling Bifrost to save this stage, so therefore the output will have that instruction to be executed. So we plug that in there. Now at the moment nothing is being saved because this box is unchecked. So this is the enable, and it actually says here that this saves all modified layers, and when this is off, the input stage, as in this node here, is simply output without any saving. So it's being executed live by Bifrost, but no saving is occurring. And it says that you can toggle enable on and off again whenever you want to save the USD files, or leave it on if you want to continually save all modifications. So essentially what that means is that if I turn this on now, then my USD stage will be saved out. So therefore, if I go to this location here, I would expect to see a .usd file. So with that turned on, let's go to my folder location. And sure enough, there's our stage.usd file. So that all appears to work. Now, if I leave this on, anything that I now do to this stage will be saved instantaneously. And that's something that I may not want to do at this moment in time. I want to have a little bit more control over what I save and also when I save it. So for the time being, I'm actually going to turn it off. And whenever I feel like I'm at a point where I need to save, then I'll just toggle it on and off, and then therefore I can control my saving. The good thing is as well, we can see from the top of the node that it actually tells us enable false. So it's telling me the status of this save stage node without having to go into the node itself. And that's really handy. Now, I just saved out the stage to a binary.usd file, but actually I'm going to change my mind and turn this into a USD-A. And that means that this will save out an ASCII version of this stage. Now that's going to be better because I can now load that particular file into a text editor, so I could actually show you the contents of that stage. Now I'm only creating very small files for this demo that will contain only very small amounts of data, so I don't have too much concern over the file size of these USD files. But of course, if I was to build out the stage with more complexity and more data, then the file size will get larger and larger, and then it becomes a little bit detrimental to try and load it into an actual text editor. So I've changed the format. I'm going to go to my save stage node, toggle this on and off, and now if we go to my location, we can see now we actually have a .usd-A file, and I can right click this and load it into my text editor, which is just Notepad++. And there we go, that's it. There's nothing there yet, so don't expect anything because I haven't actually added anything to the stage yet, but we can see here we've got the beginnings of our USD stage. So now at this point, we've created a stage here with this instruction. We've told Bifrost that we want to save this stage out as well. And then finally, that all these instructions being executed with this node here. Now, also to note about this save stage node, I didn't actually define a path here or a file name. If we look at the info panel, it actually says that this is the path of the file to save, but if you leave this empty, it will use the existing save file path of the input. So because I'd actually defined the path here and also a name, then it just inherits that when I plug it into this node. Now for this example, I was intending to recreate the Pixar USD example for sublayers. And to remind ourselves, this is what that example looks like. And there's two combinations here for how we want it to work. There's one called shot.usd and one called sequence.usd. Now I could recreate all this if I wanted to, but I'm just going to start with sequence.usd. And I'm also going to follow the exact same names that I've got here as well. So we want a layer for sequence and then 3 sublayers called dressing, layout and effects. So we now need to start thinking about how we add sublayers to our stage. Well, if we go to the create stage node, there's actually an input here that says sublayers. And we can see here as well from the info panel, it says connect any layers to add as sublayers of my new stage. Now, I don't know what node I require in order to create a USD layer. I could go to the tab menu and start looking for it, but one of the best ways to work on this now is to right click on this input here, and Bifrost will actually help you by telling you which nodes can be plugged into this particular input. So if I right click here, move down to where it says create node, and it's already telling us there's 2 nodes that I can connect to this particular input. One's called open USD layer and the other is called create USD layer. So I need to create a new layer, so I'm going to choose this one here, and this node is now loaded into our graph and automatically connected to the sublayer input. If we take a look at this create layer node, it's very, very simple. It works in the same way as the create stage, except it's just a layer, and it just says here this creates a new USD layer. The input layer here is again the file path under which the layer will be saved. So just like I just did with the stage, go to my parameters and we can literally paste in my path to my directory and now give it a backslash, and now I'll just call this sequence.usd-A. We now notice that the layer has also appeared under the layer editor, and by clicking enter I've renamed this layer in the actual node and also in the layer editor. And of course, if I was to go to my save stage, toggle the enable on and off, and now if I go to my text editor, we can see that the stage.usd file now has a sublayer or contains sequence.usd-A. If I go to my location we now have a sequence.usda also being saved out together with our stage. We don't actually need this binary.usd file anymore either, so I'm just going to delete this. But now that we have this separate USD file for the sequence layer, I can now also open this in my text editor. And when we do so, it looks the same as the stage did a moment ago. There's nothing contained in it. This will only start to be populated once we start adding things to particular layers inside our stage. Now, moving forward a little in time, I've gone ahead and created the extra layers and connections that I need. And I followed the Pixar example in terms of naming conventions, just to keep things nice and simple. I've also added a backdrop here and organized my nodes in the same sequence ordering that they are inside the USD layer editor. And using a backdrop means that I can also move them as a group if I have to make more space inside my graph editor itself. Now, just one thing to note before we move on. When I created an actual layer using the method here, create node and create USD layer, it automatically adds the layer above the previous one inside the actual layer editor. So we started with sequence down here, and then when I added a new layer that I renamed to sequence dressing, it automatically put it above the layer here in the layer editor. And that was the same when I added one for layout and then also effects. I then manually organized the layers and moved them so that it matched the actual ordering here in the layer editor. Now, if we take a look at the create stage node, the ordering is actually reversed. So sequence.usd here is actually the first input on the actual node. The second one is the dressing, and then followed by the layout and followed by the effects. So the ordering of the inputs in the node is reversed to what you see here in the layer editor. Now, I could have organized this a little bit better and put the sequence in at the top, but I thought it was better to have it mirroring inside the graph editor to that what I had inside the layer editor, just so that I can understand it, because I could be jumping between looking at the layer editor and also looking at the graph itself. In some ways, you perhaps don't even need to worry about the ordering of the ports or of the layers inside the create stage node itself, but I just thought I'd mention it just in case it looks a little bit confusing. So this concludes the first part of this tutorial. We've been able to successfully recreate that Pixar USD glossary example for sublayers. We've created a stage and we've populated that stage with sublayers, and then we've been able to save those sublayers and the stage out as separate USD files. In the next video, we'll take this stage to the next level, and using the same sublayers, we'll explore how we can add data types to these layers. And those data types can be USD prims or even scene geometry from Maya. We'll add this data to any one of our stage layers and then also save that data out as separate USD files. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next video.